Hello and welcome to this lesson for higher biology, which today is going to be looking at crop protection. Thrillingly, we're going to first begin with weeds, pests and diseases. So essentially we're looking to understand what threatens plant growth and how this can be avoided. So you need to be able to state the definition of a weed in relation to crop plants, describe the properties of annual and perennial weeds, and give examples of pests and diseases that might reduce crop production. So to begin with an idea of why and how weeds have become such an issue for crop farmers. When we have a more natural ecosystem, there's a balance existing between the producers and the consumers. We've got a diverse variety of plant species that coexist with their fellow plants, insects and microorganisms. And that diversity and genetic variety among species makes them more resilient to the weeds, pests and fungal infections that might crop up around them. However, when we have a monoculture, we've only got one species of crop plant in the area. That means the members of the crop are often genetically identical, as we've just seen through our breeding programs. So weeds, pests and fungal infections have to be tightly controlled to make sure we've got a good yield of our crop. Plants growing side by side in the same habitat are going to be naturally competing for light and water, soil nutrients and space. So competition among members of a monoculture is usually reduced by spacing out the seeds during sowing. However, that gives us a problem because the spaces can then become occupied by weeds. And essentially a weed is any kind of plant that's growing where we don't want it to grow. There's two main forms of weeds. We have annual weeds, which essentially are ones which go through their entire life cycle from seed to death, essentially in a year. They're characterised by specific things about them. They have a particularly rapid growth. They've got a very short life cycle. They produce a lot of flowers. They normally have quite a high seed output and their seeds last a long time, so they've got long-term seed viability. They also tend to have one single root at the bottom, and that helps them able to regenerate a new plant and act as a food storage organ if they need it. We also might have a broad leaf that shades out any young crop plants, and they become a particular issue if they're grown in amongst crops. On the other hand, we have perennial weeds, which have specific competitive adaptations that allow them to survive for longer, such as storage organs, and they can also carry out vegetative reproduction. Essentially, they can reproduce asexually by putting out runners or tubers. They also have a fibrous rooting system, which can compete quite strongly with a crop plant. Their leaves tend to be thinner and narrower though, and don't compete for light quite so much. We also have the issue of pests among crop plants. Most of them are invertebrate pests, which generally destroy the leaves. That's going to reduce the ability of the plant to carry out photosynthesis and therefore their ability to produce sugar, causing a reduction in yield and growth. Of the different types of pests, we have a few different ones to consider. Nematode worms, for example, tend to occur in almost all environments but are especially numerous in soil. And a lot of those tiny worms are able to attack crops and establish themselves as parasites in the root of the plant. And this has been a particular issue in potatoes in the UK. Potato nematode fungus is a particular issue. Slugs and snails can also do particular damage to crops. They tend to be more active at night, so aren't necessarily spotted, and will eat a large quantity of the leaves of the plant, stopping them from photosynthesizing. Finally, we also have herbivorous insects. They pose one of the greatest threats to food crops. They can cause many millions of pounds of damage annually because they feed on leaves, stems, roots and the underground storage organs of many crops. Some of these invertebrate pests may also act as vectors of disease. For example, if you've got aphids, can transmit viruses which cause other diseases. Most plant diseases are caused by pathogens such as fungi, bacteria and viruses. A plant disease will result in a poorer yield of the crop. We also have an issue where a blemished or an infected product is going to be less marketable than the healthy or unblemished product, so they won't be able to be sold for quite as much money, if at all. Storage life of an infected crop is also reduced because if you're going to store the crop, it's going to be less healthy and more susceptible to attack by a storage disease. It's also more likely that it's going to pass on from fruit to fruit or crop to crop. crop the longer that you store them. So from that, you should be able to state that a weed is any plant growing in relation to a crop plant and competing for its light, its water, its soil nutrients, and its space. The annual and perennial weeds are ever so slightly different, in that annual plants are ones which go through their entire life cycle from year to year, have rapid growth, a short life cycle, and produce long-term viable seeds, whereas perennial weeds have more competitive adaptations such as storage organs and are able to reproduce asexually using runners or tubers. That we have various pests and diseases that reduce crop production, for example nematode worms, slugs and snails, and any herbivorous insects such as aphids or caterpillars. That specific diseases such as potato fungus may affect our crops and result in them no longer being able to be sold as a result of them being blemished or infected.